Okay, everyone, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining the Wolf Conservation Center for our webinar to celebrate Red Wolf Week. My name is Regan Downey, and I'm the Director of Education and Advocacy at the Wolf Conservation Center. And I'm joined by Dr. Joey Hinton, the Wolf Conservation Center's Senior Research Scientist. The Wolf Conservation Center works to advance the survival of wolves by inspiring a global community through education, advocacy, research, and recovery, and we're funded entirely by people like you. So thank you. Our scientific webinar series allows us to bridge the gap between research and the general public, which allows for engaging discussions and increased advocacy. Tonight, we're excited to celebrate the 9th annual Red Wolf Week, a movement created by the Wolf Conservation Center to connect people to the world's most endangered canid. Red wolves once roamed widely across most of the eastern United States, living in wetlands, temperate forests, and coastal prairies. Today, just 18 are known to remain in the wild. So how was this uniquely North American wolf pushed to the brink of extinction, and how will they be saved? Joey and I will detail the intense persecution that led to the near extinction of red wolves, highlight legislative and collaborative efforts that successfully reintroduced them back into the wild. We'll also touch on the challenges they face currently, and most excitingly, plans to recover them within their historical range. Before we begin, I'd like to point out a few housekeeping tips. You can use two Zoom features to communicate with us. You can use the chat feature for general commentary and the Q&A box for questions. We'll have a designated question and answer section at the end of the webinar. So if you would like a question to be answered during the program, you must type it into the Q&A box. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available for viewing on the Wolf Conservation Center's YouTube channel within the next week. But with that, take it away, Joey.
All right. Thanks, Regan. Greetings, everyone. As Regan mentioned, my name is Joey Hinton. I'm the Senior Research Scientist here at the Wolf Conservation Center. Most of my background has been research on red wolves and research on coyotes in the eastern U.S. And so for this talk tonight, we're going to cover some of the history of the red wolf, its particular situation, how it wound up there. And then we're going to sort of show the road path that the Fish and Wildlife Service has laid out for recovery, and how the research that we do in our lab here at the Wolf Conservation Center is playing into that. So to start off, I'm going to show off this geographic range map for red wolves. These are figures from a paper that Sunny had published. She is a research associate in our lab. The paper focuses on the red wolf's extirpation from Alabama, and focuses on looking at the cultural effects or the cultural factors underlining that. And so the red wolf's historical range prior to European settlement in North America can be seen in this sort of polygon that has these diagonal stripes in it. By the 1960s and 70s, the population was reduced to a small remnant number of individuals, probably less than 100, to some coastal areas of the Texas-Louisiana border. And then they were eventually trapped, and a handful of those animals were used to start the captive breeding program prior to the animals' extirpation from the wild. And then this blue polygon is the North Carolina reintroduction site where some of those animals were released to in 1987 to initiate the program that we have today. The polygon here shows Alabama, and that is where the paper focuses on. What you see here in this figure is the fur cave specimen. That animal is the oldest known full skeletal remains of a prehistoric red wolf. We know it's a male because the baculum was found with it, and it represents a pretty unique specimen. It's in a museum. And so Alabama winds up providing us a pretty unique situation of looking at how basically federal policies, state policies, and cultural factors led to the red wolf's extirpation, because Alabama was part of the initial frontier for European or Euro-American settlement. So in 1830, the U.S. passed the Indian Removal Act, and with that came some federal forces and settlers into Alabama that forced Native Americans out of Alabama to Oklahoma and some other areas in the Midwest where they were put on reservations. So with the expulsion of Native people from Alabama, it set up Euro-American colonization of the area. A lot of the native habitat, along with the agricultural practices of Native Americans, were pretty much cultivated over with tobacco, corn, and tobacco, cotton, and some other cash crops that Europeans or Euro-Americans used. And so that facilitated the decline of the red wolf there. Sunny laid out some of the cultural differences between Native American tribes that used to live there, like the Cherokee and the Creeks. She also interviewed some Euro-American ranchers, and she also, because herself and another co-author are also African-American, they consider diasporic African viewpoints in the Red Wolf's history and how that laid out. And basically, the big cultural change of where wolves were able to coexist with Native Americans were switched to a more hostile culture with Euro-Americans, obviously. And so that kind of lays out the framework of what happened elsewhere. And so it's a good paper. I suggest folks look it up. It's not behind a paywall. So like I said, it's in the Stax Journal. After the extirpation of the red wolf from its historical range, as you guys know, the coyote started moving east. But prior to that, the first front of coyote colonization is thought to have happened in Central America, even though there's research emerging now with Central American researchers indicating that coyotes probably existed in this area of North America. They just did at low densities. When Europeans came in and cleared out forested areas and put cattle out there, they provided opportunity for coyotes to increase in numbers. But either way, this has historically been considered the coyotes' first expansion front, which occurred, right at the Spanish settlement. And of course, that didn't occur in the presence of wolves. There were no wolf species down in Central America. The second front occurred in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it's thought to have followed the gold rush up into Yukon and Alaska. And that actually did occur in the presence of gray wolves. These gray wolf populations weren't extirpated, so coyotes were able to colonize this region in the presence of gray wolves without any hybridization or crossbreeding or anything like that. They just were able to, adapt to those changes in the landscape. The third front occurred sort of mid-century during the 1900s, and that pushed them into the eastern U.S. But what's unique to this front, obviously, was hybridization with eastern wolves as they moved past the Great Lakes into the northeast, and hybridization with red wolves in the southeast as they moved through Texas and Louisiana into the other southeastern areas. And so, as I mentioned, the extirpation of wolves was a primary reason for this last front to push east. Coyotes coexisted with gray wolves out west, so moving to Alaska and into parts of the Northwest Territories weren't something that was, they weren't dealing with foreign carnivores they weren't used to or whatever, like they were in the east. Deforestation, elimination of wetlands, and establishment of like road networks in the east help facilitate like good habitat for coyotes. So a lot of the wet coastal habitats that were swampy just would not be good for canids. But when they were converted to agriculture and roads were put in, it made it useful for canids. And so they took advantage of that. And then eventually wildlife management were able to reestablish important prey species like white-tailed deer for them to utilize as they were establishing populations there. That's how coyotes got here. So red wolves, in this classic book called Young and Goldman, authored by Young and Goldman, The Wolves of North America, the very first plates are red wolves. If you talk to or if you read literature from the early 1900s, red wolves were considered a unique species, and they were commonly referred to in books about wolves or natural history of these regions. And so just showing that off there. Here's an article from Scientific American in 1892. This black wolf caught around New Orleans in Louisiana was taken up to Central Park, and it was put on exhibit there. And here's a coyote that they had with it, and they clearly could tell the difference between a red wolf and a coyote from that area of Texas and Louisiana. Of course, they called it Canis lupus because at that time they just referred to wolves in the eastern U.S. as timber wolves, and they had not worked out the taxonomic relationships between the Canis species here in North America. And so here's Audubon pointing out again another black wolf from Florida. So these black wolves that were red wolves, these melanistic ones, were quite common in the southeast. This is a photo of one captured, I think, up in the Tinsall River area of Louisiana, which is the northeast area up there. It's an actual photo of one. And here's a photo of a typical tawny grayish red wolf. You can clearly see it's not a coyote. These are very large animals that are our forefathers or whatever did not confuse for coyotes. That wouldn't come till later. So by the 1900s, the early 1900s, the core population of the red wolf was restricted to the Mississippi River Basin and the Gulf Coast regions here under this black polygon circle, oval, whatever. And so at that point, the federal government had begun passing federal laws allowing funding for predator removal programs to happen. And so that kind of ramped up from like 1915 through the 1950s. And so at that time, the red wolf population declined to a few hundred animals along the Texas-Louisiana border there on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. Here are some photos of animals that were killed at different time periods. You can see here, this is a large animal, clearly not a coyote, that was killed in North Louisiana sometime in the 1930s, I believe. This is a predator control agent who had killed a wolf here in the 1940s. Again, here you see a bunch of wolves on a fence here in the 1960s, where trappers were actively participating in those predator control efforts. And so you can see why this range had quickly, got reduced down to a small remnant population. So Louisiana was the last stronghold for red wolves by the 1960s. There was 4 populations, one in the Northeast, one sort of the central eastern area, and the one on the Gulf Coast. This one in the northwest corner of Louisiana was the first one to get snuffed out. And so the coyotes that were coming into Texas, as you can see here with this editorial they were recognizing at that point, that allowed them to move into northwest Louisiana and start moving into parts of the state. Eventually, these 2 populations in the northeast and central areas of Louisiana were also extirpated, facilitating the coyotes' sort of movements and migration to Mississippi and other parts of the southeast. This population along the Gulf Coast persisted, and because it persisted and was overrun with coyotes, we had outbreeding occurring, and that's where the hybridization started occurring there in Louisiana, which triggered the Fish and Wildlife Service to act. And so in 1973, the Endangered Species Act was passed, and then the Red Wolf Recovery Program was created. And from 1974 to 1980, the program trapped as many canids they could in that area of Texas and Louisiana, looking for red wolves, knowing that they were going to have to start a captive breeding program. They had managed to get their hands on like 400 animals. And these are some photos of some of those animals that they had caught there. They started the captive breeding program with some of the founders. And so some of those animals were shipped up to Point Divine Sioux in Tacoma, Washington to start the captive breeding program. And then by 1980, they weren't catching any more coyotes and whatnot. I mean, red wolves. And so they eventually just closed shop and declared that their animal was extirpated from the wild. So working in that hybrid swarm, they relied on morphometrics to distinguish a red wolf from a coyote and from a hybrid. And so these are some of the minimum measurements that they used to bring wolves into the captive breeding program to further look at them. And so, morphometrics are really important, but they also did some breeding experiments with animals that were kind of like borderline in terms of what they thought they were. And if the pups had showed true traits or heritable traits that would have indicated they were wolves, then they considered the animal a wolf. If the pups were small and coyote-like, they considered one of the parents a coyote or a hybrid. At any rate, a lot of times it's mentioned that there was no genetics done on the animals and they heavily relied on morphometrics, but that's not the case. There was actually genetics work done in the 1970s. They did find a unique biochemical marker in red wolves. We know that because they published it. It's in a paper called Farrell et al. On biochemical genetics. And they found that allele was unique to red wolves, and they only found it where the red wolves were distributed on the coast at that time, and it wasn't found in the adjacent coyote populations or gray wolf or dog populations. And so that was helped to select individuals for captive breeding. The thing is just nobody's ever followed up on that unique biomarker from that early work. So it is incorrect, I believe, to say that no genetics were used to help distinguish who the founders for the captive program were. They actually did and published that work. So out of that effort, we got 14 red wolves who became founders, and they're responsible for the almost 300 animals that we have in our safe population, as well as the, I guess, approximately 30 animals that we have in North Carolina in the wild. And so right now that safe population provides sort of the demographic security for the species, protecting it from extinction, and it provides genetic diversity to be sustained and of course, assisting with the reintroduction efforts. And so before I hand it off to Regan, I just want to show, these are just handwritten tables from Curtis Carley, the first program leader for the Red Wolf Recovery Program, indicating the captures that they had along the Gulf Coast and the Texas-Louisiana border. You can see they were catching wolves early in 1974, and then eventually it just trickles down to, one animal that they caught in 1980 in Louisiana. And these are photos that we have of some of those animals that they captured. Now, you can see they caught a total of 62 animals. I think about 40 or so of them went to Tacoma for the captive breeding program. The remaining animals are radio colored and released back out into the wild to use as like Judas animals to help find other red wolf packs and whatnot. Or they, for whatever reason, they felt maybe they were too old to send into the captive breeding program. The other ones, the 40 of them, like I said, some of them died in transit, some of them didn't breed, and the few that did wound up being the founders for the population. Okay, the red wolves. So basically, the population along the Gulf Coast was sent to Tacoma. Some individuals established a captive breeding program, and then in 1987, they were progeny from those animals were released into North Carolina to start the North Carolina project. And so with that, I hand it over to Regan. I gotta stop sharing.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Joey. And we have a lot of great questions already popping into the Q&A, so we will get to those at the end of the session. So Joey did a great job of bringing us to about 1980, 1987. And so to really reframe ourselves and also compare red wolves to other endangered species and kind of put things into a timeline. In 1967, red wolves as a species were listed as threatened with extinction under the Endangered Species Preservation Act. And this act predated what we now have, which is the Endangered Species Act. And when the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973, it was groundbreaking. It was bipartisan legislation, and it really showed a commitment to protecting and preserving endangered plants, endangered species, wildlife that were threatened with extinction. And red wolves were among the first species that were given those special protections. And this did allow for other programs to start. And so, as Joey mentioned, a recovery program was established, a plan was put in place, and a captive breeding program was established as well. And this captive breeding program used to be known as a species survival plan. And the goal was to build up that captive population of wolves to hopefully repopulate the wild at some point in the future. This program today is known as a Saving Animals from Extinction program, or a SAFE program, and the Wolf Conservation Center does participate in this captive breeding program. But in order to get those wolves into the wild, the Fish and Wildlife Service had to first establish where those wolves could go. And so we know today that North Carolina is home to the world's only wild population of red wolves. But prior to North Carolina, the Fish and Wildlife Service actually did a bit of a test. And so they looked for what they would call propagation sites or pre-release island sites. And these were areas where they had hoped they could release red wolves, and those wolves could acclimate to this wild landscape. Due to the island nature, there really was hopefully no chance of these wolves leaving the island. And it was really meant to see at first, could these wolves survive? And so Bulls Island was chosen as one of the first propagation sites. And so in the 1970s, a pair of red wolves was brought to Bulls Island. And one of the red wolves passed away shortly thereafter due to health complications. But a few years later, the Fish and Wildlife Service did release a second pair of red wolves. These and it is really something important that we should keep in mind today. I'm going to go video off with an unstable internet connection. And so it was something we really wanted to keep in mind today because it is further proof that captive-born wolves can and will survive in the wild. They just need the chance to prove that to us. And so two other pre-release sites were established, Horn Island in Mississippi, and then also the one pre-release propagation site that we still have to this day, which is St. Vincent National Wildlife Refuge off the coast of Florida. And these propagation sites gave the Fish and Wildlife Service really the proof they needed that an actual reintroduction program could be established. And so North Carolina was chosen due to the unique structure of the peninsula where red wolves would be released, great prey availability, but also taking social attitudes into consideration. The people in the area were neither pro-red wolf nor against red wolves. They were just relatively neutral. And so that gave the Fish and Wildlife Service some hope that a reintroduction program could establish and the red wolf population could start to grow. And so in 1987, on September 14th, 8 red wolves were released into North Carolina. And since then, there have been 37 adults released and 17 subadults that were released from captivity. And so those releases combined with natural breeding did allow the population to grow, but the captive breeding component has been a major factor. So the captive breeding component, as we mentioned, is now called the Saving Animals from Extinction Program. And that name change came about relatively recently. But when the program itself was started, it was known as a species survival plan. And the Wolf Conservation Center joined this captive breeding program in the early 2000s, in 2004. And the goal of this program was to ensure the long-term survival of endangered species through captive breeding, maintaining genetic diversity, and that still is the goal to this day with the Saving Animals from Extinction program. But there's an additional goal or component, and that is releases to the wild. And so the Wolf Conservation Center, with the red wolves in our care, we have a family currently with 5 1-year-olds, their 3 younger siblings and their parents, and then we have 2 separate pairs of red wolves. The goal for all of those wolves is to be released into the wild. And so we work day in and day out to make sure these wolves are maintaining their wild characteristics, that they're consuming wild prey, and that they will eventually have the chance to be released into the wild. But we've gone through some big milestones as well. So even though we joined the program in the early 2000s, we didn't actually have a litter of pups born at our center until 2010. And we had a pretty famous, I would say, litter of pups born in 2010. So we have on the screen here, we have 2 red wolf pups born again, as I mentioned, in 2010. So do bear with me for the video quality. This was filmed 15 years ago. And so these red wolves were given the names of Moose and Thicket. And I would say Moose is probably one of the most, or was one of the most well-known wolves in the captive side of the breeding program. And Thicket has had a huge impact on the wild portion of the program, but his impact most likely isn't well known to many of you. And so hopefully as we chat tonight, we'll be able to shed some light on the impact Thicket has made on the wild population and the impact he continues to leave. So Moose and Thicket were born at the Wolf Conservation Center in 2010, and Thicket flew to St. Vincent National Wildlife Refuge in 2013 because he was hopefully at one point going to be released into the wild. And he was placed in an acclimation pen with a wild female. Acclimation pens are a way for wolves to slowly acclimate or adjust to their new surroundings. And so they spend time in these temporary enclosures, usually with the wolf they're hopefully going to pair up with and be released with. And then eventually they are released. And so Thicket was released from his acclimation pen in March of 2014. And he was paired with a new female the following year, and they welcomed their first pup in 2016. So you'll see this pup here, and these images are taken by the refuge. And so you'll see these huge ears, very characteristic of a red wolf pup. And then Thicket and his mate welcomed 2 more litters in 2018 and 2019. Now, Thicket passed away in 2019 from natural causes, which is something we do celebrate because it is quite rare when a wolf lives long enough to pass away from natural causes. But little would Thicket know that just a few years later, one of his children would be released into North Carolina. But also happening during this time, as Thicket is living his life on this beautiful island, we were experiencing some challenges in the North Carolina portion of the program. And so I do apologize. I saw some comments in the chat. We do have some images that might be upsetting to some of dead red wolves, but they do help tell a story and they do highlight the challenges that wolves were facing in the wild. So we do feel it necessary to show them, but thank you in advance for bearing with us. So around the time Thicket was being transferred down to St. Vincent National Wildlife Refuge, there were some changes happening in North Carolina. In around 2012, the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission had approved night hunting of coyotes throughout the state of North Carolina. And this was including in the recovery area. And a few conservation groups did rightly point out that night hunting of coyotes in that red wolf recovery area would pose a risk to red wolves. They could be mistaken for coyotes, they could be shot and killed. And in 2014, there was a settlement that did allow for day hunting of coyotes in the recovery area with a permit. And so it seemed to be like the best case scenario. But in turn, there were some changes in the adaptive management portion of the red wolf recovery program. So one of the challenges facing red wolves beyond human-caused mortality is hybridization with coyotes. Red wolves and coyotes are very similar in size, and when there aren't a lot of red wolves in the wild, there's the potential that a red wolf might pair up with a coyote for survival, ability to find food, maintain a territory. And so to work around this, the Fish and Wildlife Service had been sterilizing coyotes in that 5-county area. And the sterilization would allow these coyotes to remain on the landscape as placeholders. And so new coyotes coming in would be kind of kicked out by these placeholder coyotes. And even if those placeholder coyotes paired up with red wolves, they wouldn't actually produce any offspring. So they weren't producing hybrids. And the sterilization effort combined with captive to wild releases was actively growing the red wolf population itself. And so you'll see here on this chart, this is data coming from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and this graph was created for a 2023 paper looking at the ecological effects of the it starts to drop pretty drastically. And that number dropped because in 2014, the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission did refuse to give permits for sterilization of coyotes. And they also called for red wolves to be declared extinct in the wild. So they kind of pulled their support for this federal recovery effort. And in 2015, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced that they were going to pause all releases of captive red wolves. And so you'll see this number drop. And then kill permits were issued to private landowners to kill red wolves on their property. Red wolves were removed from the wild. And over about a 3-year period, almost 75 red wolves died. And so the numbers dropped. And then in 2016, the Fish and Wildlife Service issued a proposal to shrink the red wolf recovery area by about 90%. And also they proposed limiting the number of red wolves that could remain in the wild. So what followed were years of lawsuits by conservation groups, rightly claiming the Fish and Wildlife Service was violating the Endangered Species Act by not doing everything in their power to recover this species. And so finally, in 2021, a judge did order the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to resume releases of red wolves from captivity to help bolster that dwindling population. Because in 2020, at the end of 2020, there were 7 red wolves known to remain in the wild, and that was it. And so thankfully, releases did resume in 2021. And so we are slowly seeing a growth in numbers. The Wolf Conservation Center itself was especially excited in 2021 because one of the red wolves born at our center was one of the lucky wolves chosen for release. So Devin, the wolf pictured here, a nice pup photo, was born at the Wolf Conservation Center in 2018, and he and his siblings lived at the center for a few years. They lived off exhibit primarily, and they grew up rarely seeing people. And in 2021, Devin was released to North Carolina. So he flew on a little private airplane from New York down to North Carolina, and he was placed in an acclimation pen with a wild female. And much to our excitement, the pair was soon released into the wild in July of 2021. And now I know this might seem a little bit weird, but I think, kind of put yourself in Devin's shoes and imagine growing up living behind a fence and never being able to decide where you want to go. Still living a great life, but never having the free will to roam where you wanted to go. And then imagine having a fence opened up in front of you and you can go wherever you want and you can explore. There's a whole world in front of you. And it is very, I imagine, very exciting, probably very scary, but it's something we think every wolf deserves to have. We think every wolf who's in captivity should have that chance to experience the wild. And Devin did experience the wild. Unfortunately, Devin was only in the wild for a few short days before he was struck and killed by a vehicle while attempting to cross Highway 64. So Highway 64 cuts right through the recovery area, and it is where a lot of red wolves and other native wildlife are killed each year because the roads can be dark and there's quick turns. And so we were devastated to hear of Devin's passing, but we are comforted in knowing that the wild has become safer because of wolves like Devin. So the Fish and Wildlife Service now gives wolves bright orange reflective radio collars or GPS collars. They also have these mobile signs that can move based on red wolf movements. So drivers know to keep an eye out for these endangered red wolves. There's also been exciting changes more recently, thanks to groups like Wildlands Network, Center for Biological Diversity, and the federal government approving grants for highway wildlife crossings. So we are excited by these changes and hope that they will support future red wolves. We also, though, are excited to know that for those releases that don't work out, there are releases that do. And so going back to Thicket, our red wolf that we released to St. Vincent back in 2014, his pup, his son, known as M2323, the M stands for male, and 2323 means he is the 2,323rd red wolf that's been born since that captive breeding program started. He was released into North Carolina. This is a picture of him taken by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in one of their remote cameras. He was released into the wild, and he did have puppies. So this video was taken from the Fish and Wildlife Service's webcams or trail cameras, and it shows members of M2323's family moving throughout the wild. And sadly, M2323 did pass away back in 2023, but his offspring still exist on the landscape. And 4 of his kids still exist in the wild today. 2 of his daughters have pups of their own that were born this year as first-time moms. And so it's exciting for us to think about that this New York wolf, born and bred, who flew down to Florida, now has great-grandchildren, we'll figure out the genealogy, but now has offspring, relatives living in the wild and repopulating the wild. And so we love knowing that Thicket created this lineage of wolves that are thriving on the wild landscape. And we can say that red wolves are starting to thrive. So as of August, there are 18 known red wolves existing on the wild landscape, meaning 18 red wolves with active collars. So we know for a fact that they are alive. We know where they are. And there were 4 litters of pups born this year, totaling 16 puppies. And the Fish and Wildlife Service estimates that there could be, of those 16, anywhere from 10 to 12 still existing today. And the Wolf Conservation Center is also celebrating some exciting developments as well. We had 3 red wolf puppies born this year. We haven't had red wolf pups born on site since about 2018. So this has been exciting for us as well. So these are the 3 pictured here. And They are thriving. You can watch them on our live webcams. They're very, very cute. And these pups up here are M2323's grandchildren. So also thriving on the wild landscape. And we're excited because we know that with ongoing research, education, and outreach, we can all work together to create a better future and world for red wolves. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and toss it back to Joey, who's going to detail some of our future plans and what we envision for red wolf recovery.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Regan. Appreciate it. I am going to share and try to get my stuff set up so everyone can see. Regan, can you confirm you can see that?
Yes, looks great.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So I'm going to start diving into the ongoing research that we have. But before I do that, I want to lay out sort of the Fish and Wildlife Service's sort of strategy for recovering the red wolf in its historical range so that I can sort of point out to where we are trying to contribute to that effort with our ongoing research. I get this. I don't know. Sorry, guys. All right, there we go. All right. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has three primary strategies or components to this strategy for recovering the red wolf. I don't put them in the same order as the Fish and Wildlife Service. I may use a different language or terminology, but it's all the same. The first thing is improving conditions to increase the captive for the wild red wolf populations. As I mentioned before, the safeguard from extinction for the red wolf is the safe population. And so it's important that captive population is robust and stable so that you can pull from it, right? Because we don't have, except for the 30 that we have in North Carolina, there's no other red wolves in the wild. So if you were to start additional sites, you would probably depend on the safe population. And if you're pulling from that population and you have high mortality rates of animals that are being reintroduced into the wild for the first time, you want to ensure that you don't crash your captive population. So modeling efforts, I guess, have suggested that we should target 400 animals in the captive population, a minimum of 400. And we have about 50 some facilities. I think we have 51 facilities that have about 300 animals in it right now, I suppose. And so one way to increase the population pretty quickly is to get new facilities that can offer more space. Right now, the population is limited by space more than anything. And so acquiring new participants or facilities that are going to partner with SAFE would be great. Other aspects is research to improve reproduction and translocation success. The red wolf historically in captive settings has a low pairing success. I think historically it's been like 1 out of 5, so about 20% of the wolves that are paired together produce pups. And then the pup survival is about 60%. The last couple of years, there's been an uptick in both. I think it's now 1 out of 4, so around 25, 26% of the wolves that are paired with each other wind up producing pups. And I think about 80% of the pups are now surviving in captive settings. So that's important, obviously, for increasing the captive population. The other aspect too is when you select these animals for release into the wild, you want to make sure that you're not habituating them to humans, and you're not releasing animals that are not, or too conditioned for human care, and wind up being animals that wind up causing problems and getting themselves either killed or recaptured for placement back into the captive setting. So part of the research there is needed is developing good criteria for assessing the personalities of these wolves and the conditions that facilitate better animals for wild settings, I suppose. In the wild, addressing key threats are going to be key for improving the wild population's chances of persisting. And the two main ones are going to be shooting deaths and vehicle collisions. So wolves are most likely to die either on the roads, crossing them by people, hitting them with their cars, or they wind up getting shot or trapped by sportsmen. In many cases, it's confusion with them being coyotes. Sometimes it's not, but regardless, those are the two primary anthropogenic causes of mortality for wolves that need to be mitigated. And then finally, the populations have to be self-sufficient. So the wolves require management, one, because there's so few of them, out there, they require augmentation from the safe population, and two, because they do outbreed with coyotes. There's some efforts there to prevent introgression and hybridization. And so for those populations to be self-sufficient, those two management techniques or approaches have to be sort of eliminated. So the wolves are going to have to do it themselves. And so that's part of the process. And of course, once we can do that in North Carolina and we have a secure captive population, then you can go ahead and look for 2 additional sites to have that minimum of 3 sites for red wolf recovery criteria. And so this is essentially the second one is essentially saying that we should expand the red wolf throughout its historical range with additional release sites. And then finally, to do that, you need to build collaborative partnerships. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has readily admitted that they can't do this on their own. They require working with other nonprofits, landowners, the state agencies, and whatnot. And so in doing that, we all have different roles and responsibilities. And so when we participate, there are some expectations that we fulfill those roles and responsibilities. But ultimately, it's the Fish and Wildlife Service that is responsible for recovering the species. If things don't go well, they're the ones who get drug into court. But at some point, if they do hit their recovery benchmarks, they hand the populations off to the state agencies, and the state agencies at that point are the ones who are managing the population. So this is why it's so important for the feds and the state agencies to have a really good working relationship, because at some point, if we are successful in recovering the species, then the state agencies take over and they manage them just like they do any other state trusted species. So the criteria for recovering the red wolf. The first one is to establish 3 viable populations. We have 1 population in North Carolina in the wild. It's not viable yet, obviously, but that's an important thing we need to do before we consider 2 other sites, I think. And of course, criterion 2 is to make sure that they sort of meet criteria for viability. The first one is that at least one of these populations can have at least 180 wolves. And it looks like the 5-county area in North Carolina can probably have that many wolves. I think 2006, they hit 150, 151 animals. And they had not used all the 5 counties. It wasn't saturated with wolves. There's still other spaces that they could have filled in on. And then the other 2 populations established elsewhere could have are going to need at least 280 animals each. They need to maintain at least 80% of their genetic diversity, and they need to be self-sufficient for at least 10 years where the population is stable and growing. And as I mentioned before, self-sufficient is the population is not relying on safe animals to help augment their numbers. And the Fish and Wildlife Service is not actively managing coyotes to prevent hybridization, that the wolves themselves are replacing them on the landscape, and they're finding other wolves and breeding with the wolves, and they're not messing with coyotes to outbreed and create hybrids. And then those populations have to have a 95% chance of persisting for the next century. And then the last one is to maintain, to make sure these long-term commitments are in place, because ultimately, like I mentioned, they're going to have to hand this over to the state agencies if they are successful in recovering the species. And that's going to require, trust and good working relationship between agencies and nonprofit groups, obviously. And the only way you do that is by working well together. And through that, you'll develop those long-term commitments. And so, so those are the criteria for recovery. And I'm going to go through our research projects that we are currently collaborating with other institutions and working with Fish and Wildlife Service on to assist them with achieving those, benchmarks. The first one is, assessing the red wolf's historical range for future introduction sites. The second one is developing immersive learning programs to help build public empathy for red wolves. Third one is improving reproductive and translocation success for ex situ red wolves. That's the captive animals. And then the last one I'll discuss is assessing the red wolf's legacy along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana. So this first project that we call the Reintroduction Site Project, the primary goal is to provide science necessary for the red wolf recovery program to make decisions about future reintroduction sites. And so what we're doing is working with a bunch of collaborators to coalesce as much ecological, social, and management data as possible to eventually model this out. The project itself is not one large project, but it's a composite of smaller projects that can look at these things on their own and produce papers and results and whatnot that can be used eventually to be brought together for one final analysis. But ultimately, we're going to be using a bunch of spatially explicit modeling to help understand red wolf and coyote ecology, people's acceptance and tolerance for red wolves, and then how these animals can be managed in the landscape. So the main collaborators I'm working with on the social tolerance component is Jeremy Bruscutter at Ohio State University, John Vucetich out of Michigan Tech University, Ricky Burrow, who's with the USGS, Neil Carter out of Michigan University, and Mark Elbrock with Panthera. And so we have surveyed 72 counties throughout the red wolf historical range, which is like these 26 states in the eastern US. And we did a second round, so I think we have about 140 now. And the point of this is to get people's support for red wolf reintroduction, and then we will correlate that with other spatial predictors, like you see a map here of like the percentage of hunting in those counties. And so with that, we can look at the percentage of education or the education level within those counties, the income level, the amount of urbanization, how much agriculture is there, which way the county voted, whether it went red or blue. And like I said, if there is a strong hunting tradition there in those counties, and use that and correlate it with people's support and opposition for red wolf recovery. And then we can use that information to build robust models to predict into those counties that we didn't survey, which would be these white counties, to help develop those spatially explicit maps for support for red wolves. The other part is the ecological data. So this is a heat map that I created for a paper for my PhD work, using GPS data from red wolves in North Carolina. You can see the peninsula here shows hot spots where red wolves occur. Blue areas are areas that they don't really use on the peninsula. So we know, in an area that's like 3/4 the size of Yellowstone, red wolves right now are only using probably about 60% of it, maybe 70% of it is good enough habitat. And so this helps with us understanding where they may establish their territories and how well that space could hold, or how many territories that the area could hold. And it gives us an idea of what the minimum population size could be for these areas. As we collect more data on red wolves and coyotes, we can create these heat maps across the historical range to help find that ecological data. So then you have a spatial map of a heat map for social tolerance for red wolves, and then you have a heat map for habitat suitability, and then you can overlay them or interact them to find areas that could be potentially good for coexistence. You have good support for the wolves, and then you have good habitat, and it should be a good spot for releasing these animals possibly. The problem is once you release them, they're gonna wind up dying of something, and you want red wolves to die naturally, but in a landscape that's predominantly human or anthropogenic, that's not going to be the case. And so what you see here is annual survival by month for red wolves in the North Carolina reintroduction site that I published a few years ago in JWM. The mortality trends are pretty clear. You see this decline in October through December. That's correlates or corresponds with the white-tailed deer hunting season, and the small dip in April, May corresponds with spring gobbler. And they're 2 times the year when you have hunters out and about. So that's when shooting deaths are most common. What we found was that red wolves are 7 times more likely to die during this period of the hunting season. Adult wolves themselves were 10 times more likely to die, and that and most of the wolves were dying before they were 4 years of age. And so unfortunately, that sort of primed the landscape for outbreeding. So this discourages red wolves from maintaining, packs. Basically you have 2 animals come together, form a breeding pair, they would breed, drop pups, and then they would wind up getting shot within a year or so of doing that. If you want stable packs with good, like multi or intergenerational offspring, contained within that territory because of delayed dispersal, you need the wolves to breed multiple years. You just can't have them breed once a year. They're not foxes, is my point. They need to be able to have higher survival rates so that they can build up those packs. And when they're not doing that, of course, that facilitates coyote interactions and allows some of the wolves to outbreed with coyotes. So the hybridization is a direct consequence of this high mortality rate that they're experiencing on the landscape. So Colleen O'Donnell, who's a PhD student at the University of Maryland, and she works with us part-time, has been looking at some of this data with me. And so she's using what they call this space-time cluster correlations to see if there is a time factor with the spatial data, to see if we can get at some underlining larger issues that might be driving how wolves are getting shot out there. And so this stuff is used for disease outbreaks, and I think for looking at crime rates and stuff like that in urban areas. Anyway, so what you see here on the right is polygons that we use for the analyses, and looking at deaths across the red wolves, like time out there, its population. I don't want that. I want the laser pointer. Thank you. Over across this, we're looking at deaths as the population goes from 1987 until 2020. And what we found is areas that are green, these green polygons, that's a lot of just background noise, incidental deaths along this sort of population trend that is related to incidental killings. People just accidentally shooting wolves or them getting hit by cars or whatever. Now they would be getting hit by cars. Hey, this is gunshot mortality. So this is them being harvested during the hunting season by people who thought they were coyotes. What's in red is corresponding with deaths from like 2003 to about 2010, and that corresponds with the increase in coyote numbers in the area. And so we see a severe like uptick in red wolf mortality that is tied with the coyotes showing up. And so we think that may be tied to people's perception of or awareness or vigilance with coyotes, and they're just shooting more out there, and the wolves are being targeted for that for whatever reason. And finally, that blue cluster is correlated with this policy shift in 2014 when the Fish and Wildlife Service issued take permits and then began responding to complaints and allowing private landowners to trap their own wolves and whatnot. And so we do see a significant uptick there with mortality. So we are seeing some motivation, I guess, with why people are killing wolves. In North Carolina, this type of analysis could be useful when we apply it to coyotes in other areas that we have data for, and it could help understand when sites are selected that the Fish and Wildlife Service may have existing data to anticipate how people would respond to wolves once they're released. So even though you have a situation where you may have like good support in that area for wolves and you may have good habitat, it may only take a few people who are upset and willing to do something to become like a major drag on recovery efforts. And so this kind of analysis is important there. Just to give you an idea of what's happening in North Carolina from the wolf's perspective, everywhere in that 5-county area is huntable habitat for people. And so a lot of it's dog hunting is common. If they're not using dog hunting, they have hunting towers, they do bait, and they have food plots. So the wolves love linear corridors, as do coyotes. And so hunters often have these shooting alleys and these corridors that they set up on. And so this is where wolves are mostly at risk of getting killed out there. So looking at management of game species, looking at hunting seasons and whatnot is relevant for understanding, the potential risk that wolves would encounter in other sites too. So as you can see here, that's the hunting tower. There's a bait, there's a corn feeder, and then you have a food plot here that draws in deer, turkey and whatnot. And of course it draws in the wolves. And it could be a situation where they get shot and whatnot. Now, this stuff varies quite a bit from one part of the state to the next. So in the western part of North Carolina, the whitetail deer hunting season is from like November 30th to January 1st. So it's like 4 weeks. In the 5-county area, it's from October 15th to January 1st. So it's like 10 weeks. And so you're talking an extra 6 weeks of wolves being exposed to this type of hunting pressure. And so that's going to vary quite a bit across the historical range. And so collecting that data could show the temporal window of when we should start expecting mortality to happen with wolves and whatnot. And so that data is relevant for looking for future sites and something we'll be collecting. The next project is this immersive learning project where we are working with the New Jersey Institute of Technology with Rita and Andres. And some of their undergrads have put together some pretty cool virtual reality demos. And of course, the North Carolina Wildlife Federation, we're working with Kat too. She's a collaborator on this. The point is trying to figure out how to use gaming technology and whatnot, and other forms of extended reality technology to promote red wolf recovery efforts and the red wolf itself to help build empathy from the public. Sunny has a paper in review right now. I think she submitted to Human Dimensions of Wildlife. Looking at different types of gaming platforms that could be useful if we want to build empathy using first person scenarios where the individual is actually the wolf could help them build empathy for red wolves. If you're looking for them to have a better understanding of management and the Fish and Wildlife Service's perspective in terms of restoring the red wolf to the landscape, you could do more of a a risk type game, risk being that old game, board game strategy wise, and that's now probably more like Sims and Civilization. I don't play video games, so I couldn't tell you, but that's what this would be. It would be more strategy based. And then a narrative experience would be something like, you know, you're releasing, as you mentioned here, a wolf is getting released into the wild, and you follow the fate of that wolf, and that could give the player a different experience. And of course, her and I were talking about like whether the technology itself is important or whether or not it's the actual like using the technology to build communication between the community and the Fish and Wildlife Service, and providing different means of reporting when people see wolves along roads or maybe around their properties, or if they have other issues, basically improving communications between locals and the Fish and Wildlife Service. So this right here is just like a small rendering. If I can get it to go, I guess not. Anyway, that's a demo that the undergrads put together this summer. It's gotten a lot better. It's something I'm working on. Here's another angle of it. It's just like very early stages. We're putting in for grants to help hire some grad students to work on this. But the idea here is, you know, somebody comes into a facility, they put on those goggles, and they can interact with this wolf here with a narrator. And so they can ask the wolf questions like, you know, what do you eat? And the narrator will say, well, they like to eat mice and they chase deer and whatnot. And so you may see the wolf go somewhere and start mousing. Then the student could, or the kid could ask something else like, why do you like different types of habitat? And a narrative would explain why different habitats are important to wolves in terms of denning ecology or foraging ecology or whatnot. So hopefully this is something that we can produce here in the short term soon. I know time's flying. So the next project is what we call the Ex-Situ project. The point of this, working with Utah State, the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, and North Carolina Zoo at Asheboro, is to basically improve reproductive success and translocation success for the captive population. The first one is to build these behavioral profiles so that we understand personality types for wolves, how those personality types and husbandry practices may influence the pair bonding success between wolves. Eventually, when some of those wolves are released into the wild, how this pipeline influences success in the wild in terms of how long they're on the landscape before they establish a home range, and do they survive and produce pups. And then finally, you know, if they're able to, and then look at the contributions that the translocations make to the wild population. So the behavioral test is pretty simple. They look at flight initiation, distance test, novel object test, sociability test, and then we look at how they handle capture and handling, give them scores. The point of that is to basically look at, like, you know, how bold they are versus how shy they are, and that sort of continuum to help understand their behaviors. And then we sort of look at that along with other factors in terms of how well they copulate with each other once they're paired up, pregnancy rates, and then once they drop pups, the offspring survival, and whether or not they are taking care of their pups. And that should help with developing better criteria for selecting mates to pair up together and to improve husbandry practices. And then, of course, when these animals are selected and released into the wild, as I mentioned, the ones that do get put back out there, we want to look at survival time, whether or not they reproduce in the wild, and their likelihood of being recaptured, because they may be problem animals if they were habituated and we didn't realize that. And then finally, assess how those translocations influence population processes of growth of the population in North Carolina. So pup fostering is part of the birth process. It's essentially the compensatory reproduction. So there's a delayed response. And of course, there's placeholders that were preventing hybrids from being formed. But if they're adult size releases, that's more of a compensatory immigration process when the animals are released out there as solitary animals, or they're paired up with something. And so that increases recruitment and also genetic diversity. And then, of course, the Fish and Wildlife Service tries to mitigate deaths. So this is looking at the population processes in the wild and where management is having the most impact, or where the management is trying to impact. And so basically from this perspective is you have a captive animal, and if you want to put it out there as a pup, then it's fostered into a wild litter, and then it grows up to be a predisperser, something that's like, 18 months old before it winds up dispersing, and then it becomes a transient, and then eventually finds a mate, becomes a resident, and then starts producing pups. But if it's not a puppy and it's released as an adult size animal, it's either put out as a transient and then it wanders around and finds a potential mate and starts reproducing, or it's put out there with a wild animal who settles in immediately, they start reproducing, or it's released as a offspring with a family unit, maybe an 8-month-old animal, and then it goes through these stages. So when you release animals or translocate animals from safe into the wild, you're putting them into different processes or different stages in the wild population, and you should have different expectations for those releases. Some of those releases are going to wind up having higher mortality rates, like putting them out as transients versus putting them out as pups. But the payoff is going to take longer for the pups because they got to go through these stages before they find a mate and breed. So there's more delayed response there. And finally, the Texas Louisiana Canid project, the Gulf Coast stuff. As you guys may be aware, a few years ago we went down there to live trap animals. The point of that was to collect genetic and morphological data on them, to assess what they are, to put GPS collars out there, track their movements, look at their space use, analyze survival, and then use that data to help assess the taxonomy of those animals, and then see what is going on in terms of the red wolf's legacy in the region. So with a former group, we did produce a paper showing that these animals do have quite a bit of admixture in them, anywhere from 20 to 70% of their admixture was contributed or attributed to red wolves. And you can see it varies on the landscape. The the primary area where we found a lot of ancestry was in the southwest corner of Louisiana, in a couple areas where they are pretty much protected, like on Sabine, there's no hunting. And then on the FR Ranch, there's no hunting there either. Out here where we trapped over Jefferson Davis County or Parish and over this area, they were commonly like managed for predator control. So even though they have red wolf genetics in them, morphometrically, they are essentially something similar to a hybrid or a coyote. This is a PCA or a PC graph or a PCA analysis. Here on the PC1 axis is body size, and you can see this cluster of wolves. They're all above 0, indicating large body size. Coyotes here in yellow are all below 0, indicating small body size. They don't overlap. Red wolves are considerably larger than coyotes. Hybrids fall in between, with some hybrids being similar in size as some small wolves. The Gulf Coast canids in these blue triangles exhibit very similar body sizes as hybrids do. But however, on this PC2 axis, where they sort of diverge from the rest of the animals in this grouping down here, is their ear size. So these animals have small heads and big ears. So they're very hybrid-like in their shoulder heights. They're tall like a hybrid, but their heads are small like a western coyote, and they have ears that are almost similar to a red wolf size ears. So they have very big ears. So based on the morphometric data, they're coyotes with some introgression in them. This here shows the distribution maybe of these Gulf Coast canids in Southwest Louisiana. Areas that are, in dark blue, I guess, is very low habitat quality for them because they're particularly like adapted to coastal wetlands. So as you come out of those coastal wetland habitats and get into more agriculture and timber pine plantations, you get more eastern coyote, western coyote types. So these dark areas are not absent of coyotes. There are coyotes there. They're just sort of western or eastern coyote phenotypes. This sort of wetland phenotype is in these white areas. And this is mostly coastal saltwater marshes and large river floodplains that they like. They prefer the wet stuff. Spreading this out into Texas, predicting out, this is Houston over here, this is Southeast Texas, Chambers County, Jefferson County, and then this is where we were at. So the Louisiana-Texas border is right here. What's in orange is the Gulf Coast canids that we captured for our project. what's in red and white circles are red wolves that were caught between 1974 and 1980. The ones with the white with the red circle in the center are the founders that were used. And you can see most of the red wolves, if not all of them, are falling within the habitat that that the Gulf Coast canids were also being mostly captured into. So there's a good correlation between what these animals are using and what red wolves were being found at, 40 years ago. The thing is their survival is really high. I haven't seen coyote survival like this in any other studies we have. So here is 40 animals that we have for our research. And at the end of 365 days, you have about 80% survival rate for Gulf Coast canids. But elsewhere from our study areas, annual survival rates for coyotes are about 47%, so around 50%. Half the coyotes that we radio mark are surviving the year, whereas like 8 out of 10 coyotes or Gulf Coast canids that we mark survive the year. And what's really unique is that the transients have very good survival, almost equivalent survival to the residents. So they're both about 80%. In these populations elsewhere, usually residents have like a 70% survival for the year, and then transients are probably going to be around 30% or so. They have significantly lower survival rates. So the high survival rates here on the Gulf Coast are pretty important. So when we compare them to North Carolina, where we have coyotes coexisting with red wolves, we see that Gulf Coast canids have a 26% greater survival rate than those coyotes do. When we compare them to animals in Wisconsin, resident animals had 17% higher survival rates than those in Wisconsin did. Transients had 40% higher survival rates than those reported in Wisconsin. As I mentioned, transients usually have terrible survival. It's very dangerous to traverse the landscape. And so what does this mean for coyotes, or not coyotes, but for the Gulf Coast canids? For one, this increases mate availability. They're just out there. They survive. And so when you lose your mate and you're wanting a new mate, you're more likely to encounter a Gulf Coast canid than you are a typical Western or Eastern coyote. And so that allows them to fill breeding vacancies. And so when they're able to do that, that facilitates that gene flow. And that's what's keeping the red wolf ancestry out there on the landscape, is that these animals are able to basically disperse across the landscape safely for, a year or two until they find a mate, and then they can settle in. That's not what we see elsewhere with coyotes. They tend to have to do it within a few months before they ultimately get killed. And so this allows them to saturate the Gulf Coast area along the coast there, and those coastal wetland marshes. And because they can saturate it and they have animals sort of moving around looking for space to take over, they prevent inland coyotes from immigrating into those coastal habitats. And since they're not doing that, they aren't filling in vacancies and sort of genetically assimilating or swamping out these Gulf Coast canids. And this is kind of what we want to happen in North Carolina. This is where the Texas-Louisiana projects are really important. It's not so much the wolf genes that are out there, but how they're persisting. And we're seeing how the population is structured and what processes are really important. So as you establish red wolf packs in a reintroduction site like North Carolina, you want to get a healthy mosaic packed in there. And so then that they have, offspring dispersing out, sort of filling in those intermediate or intermittent areas between the packs, sort of biding and waiting for an opportunity to fill in a vacancy that happens through a death, hopefully naturally. And when they do that, then you have a wolf parent with a wolf, and then it's breeding, and then you're producing more wolf pups. But if you have high mortality rate, what you get are coyotes filling in those interstitial areas. And then when a wolf dies, the coyote fills in, and then you get the hybridization, and then you lose your wolves. And so this is sort of laying out the blueprints of, I think, of how you need to figure out to restore population processes to a red wolf population at a site. And so our collaborators in this project now are Tanner. He's a master's student at McNeese State with Justin Hoffman and Eddie Lyons. We're working with John Tomachek at Texas A&M, Amy Shaw with Canid Project, and then Ben Sachs is our new geneticist, along with Lauren Henley at Rice University, and then Linda Rutledge, who's doing Eastern wolf work. And that is all I have. I know we've gone over quite a bit, so sorry about that. It's all yours, Regan.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joey. And thank you everyone for all of your wonderful questions. As a reminder, if you do have any questions, please type them into the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. We will not be addressing any questions in the chat, but I did just want to address a few things before I start posing some questions to you, Joey. We did have a great comment in the chat about doing education programs and engaging with schools and students, and that was a perfect prompt for us. We do offer education programs. In fact, this week we are offering free virtual field trips to schools, both schools in North Carolina and schools across the country, so they can better learn about red wolves and wolves in general and hopefully build some of that empathy Joey was talking about. And that also ties into our role as not just a safe participant, but also an education-based NGO as well. So safe participants in or participants in the captive breeding program, the SAFE program, they do house red wolves and prepare these red wolves for release, which does contribute to broader recovery goals in terms of preserving genetic diversity and really creating and maintaining wolves that can and would be successful release candidates. And that's something the Wolf Conservation Center takes very seriously. We take a lot of pride in how we, I don't even like to say how we raise these wolves because the wolves are raising themselves, but we give these wolves remote enclosures, they consume wild prey. And so all of that is done to ensure that they can be released either into North Carolina or into future recovery sites and give both those wolves, those individuals, the best possible life, but then also ensure that the species itself has a long-term lifespan as well. So wanted to address both the comment and then, oh, I see someone saying their high school just did it. Thank you so much for the comments. So Joey, to get to some of the questions that we have, we had a lot of great questions come in. And I think maybe one of the questions that is just good to start with that might kind of encompass some of the other questions as well. Why North Carolina for release? Why other states on the East Coast or on the East for releases if there might be other states like California, for example, or other states where they might be more tolerant to carnivores? So why specifically those states that we're looking at?
Okay, yeah, so North Carolina was selected just because at the time, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service acquired Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. It was new. There were no coyotes there. The area there has very low human density. I think there's like 8,000 people there now. Is even fewer in 1987. So they just, low human conflict and no outbreeding with coyotes, stuff like that. So they did it for that reason. So that's why North Carolina was selected. Regarding other sites, the Fish and Wildlife Service is not, they don't have anything identified. I understand what you're asking about, like a state like California. So if you're looking at potential states and you want to find like a blue state that would be more, you think would be more open because it's more liberal, yeah, you would have to go north with the populations. Maybe Virginia, you may have to consider like the Delmarva Peninsula, where you have Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland, and whatnot. Because if you go to like Arkansas or, Louisiana is a very, very conservative state, stuff like that, if that's what you're concerned about. But you kind of don't have an option with the historical range. I have stretched the range out to include New England, but Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't consider that part of their historical range. They cap it out at like Pennsylvania and southern New York and whatnot, and the southern part of New England. And so you're mostly looking at the southeast. But I mean, it can work, I think. It's kind of weird in my field experience. Some of these, what you think very conservative guys wouldn't want to support wolves, and they wind up doing it. And so, hopefully that answered the question.
I think so. Thanks so much, Joey. Looking forward at recovery, understanding that for the Fish and Wildlife Service, the goal for recovery of red wolves is to have them delisted and turn management over to the states. And for an organization like ours, recovery and long-term survival continues beyond that, continues beyond delisting. We want a population or a world where wolves thrive, where they're free from persecution and from hunting. So we do have a question: when the criteria laid out by the Fish and Wildlife Service is met, so when they have those three populations, they're able to maintain those populations without human involvement, and states take over red wolf management. Are the states required to still maintain those same population goals, or have those conversations not started yet, since we're not near that point?
Honestly, I would, yeah, I suspect that there's some minimum criteria for listing. So if they fall below those thresholds, they would get relisted, I suppose. I'm not Fish and Wildlife Service, so I don't know how to answer that specifically. Fish and Wildlife Service is having a call next week, I think. So you can ask them there, but I would suspect that in the event that they hit those benchmarks and they hand over the animals to state management or to the states, hopefully the states themselves have their management plans in place. They've got their teams ready to go, and they do it, and who knows? I don't know. It's so far out that we don't spend much time talking about that. Most of I would say our efforts are thinking about North Carolina and getting that population working again. And that population can't, I don't think it can go to the commission in terms of management and control until the other two sites are established and they meet their criteria. So.
Awesome. Thanks for explaining that, Joey. We have another question regarding red wolf territory, space use, and kind of aggression in general. So do red wolves ever need to fight for territory? And then similarly, is there red wolf coyote aggression in terms of fighting for space and resources?
Yeah, it's a good question. So red wolves don't interact with coyotes like gray wolves do because they outbreed with them, they hybridize with them. Gray wolves don't. They can share space with coyotes and not worry about coyotes breeding their offspring or breeding their mate. Red wolves don't have that option. So they usurp coyotes. They push them out completely. There's no overlap between their territories with coyotes. So red wolves either will displace and kill coyotes to take that space and use it for breeding, or they breed coyotes. So it's like a binary thing. Like I'm gonna beat you up or I'm gonna breed you, depending on the situation. And so they do have a lot of interspecific strife with coyotes, and their strife is very similar to what you see with gray wolves. I mean, we've documented with placeholders, like 11 or 12% of the placeholders are killed by red wolves. And gray wolf studies have shown that they kill anywhere between like 7 and 16% of the coyotes that they are, radio marked and monitored for studies. And so they're right there. But I would add that a lot of coyote death is indirect because they're safe in their territories. It's good habitat for them to be in. And then the wolf comes in and pushes it out. That coyote is no longer a resident. It's now a transient. So it had an annual survival rate of like 70%. Now its annual survival is going to be around 40%. And it's more likely to get hit by a car or shot by a hunter or trapped. And so the wolves can indirectly cause a lot of red wolf or coyote mortalities just by displacing them. Gray wolves don't displace coyotes out of their territories. They may kill a coyote in a territory that it's sharing with it, but I don't think they actually run them off like that.
Great. Thanks, Joey. And I'm actually going to take this next question. Someone asked, they understand the Wolf Center is getting a red wolf family from North Carolina. How many will they be integrated with our existing wolves, or will they have their own enclosure? So yes, many of you might remember red wolf Martha, who was born at the Wolf Conservation Center in 2018. And a few years ago, she was introduced to a red wolf named Oka. And they recently left us to go to the Museum of Life and Science in Durham, North Carolina. And they actually welcomed pups this spring. They had 3 puppies. And we found out this summer at the annual Red Wolf Safe meeting, when breeding plans are established, we found out that Martha, Oka, and their 3 pups are going to be coming back to the Wolf Center. So we are very excited. They will be having their own enclosure. All of the red wolves at the Wolf Conservation Center live in enclosures with their families. So we don't mix different family groups. Everyone is living with a family unit just as they would in the wild. And so Martha and Oka are coming back, and they will have their own enclosure, and you will be able to watch them on webcam. So we are very excited, and thank you for sharing in our excitement. Joey, we are also getting some questions about red wolves and eastern wolves. And wondering, knowing that eastern wolves face similar challenges, low populations, protections are a bit different in terms of where they are protected, where they're not, and they have, more pockets of eastern wolf numbers. Wondering if we're able to improve public support for red wolves, build empathy. Do you think kind of either way, increasing empathy for eastern wolves would benefit red wolves, and vice versa? Would increasing empathy for red wolves benefit eastern wolves?
Yeah, I think it does for both. I mean, I think building public empathy for coyotes is great for red wolves and probably eastern wolves too, because it facilitates the tolerance for coexistence, which means that red wolves would be mistaken for coyotes because there are probably fewer people out there wanting a gun for them. But yeah, I think the empathy for both is growing. It's something I haven't seen like it's been a lot it's been a lot better since when I got into the field like 20 years ago. People actually know what red wolves are now. I feel like I'm rambling on this question, but the thing about the eastern wolf population is that they do have Algonquin Provincial Park, APP, that is protected. Like there's no hunting or trapping of any canid there. And so that's allowed the eastern wolves to pretty much pack in and maintain a core population, I think of about 300 animals or something like that. And so they don't have any hybridization. That's a self-sufficient population that they don't have to manage. And they tolerate some introgression there, but it's not a problem. Where you have introgression and hybridization between the two is when eastern wolves disperse out of APP into the surrounding private lands where there's less protection. And in that situation, there are coyotes there, and the human caused mortality kills some of those wolves or allows them to, or they settle in and start interacting with other types of canis species out there, Great Lakes gray wolves and coyotes and whatnot. Would love to have that in North Carolina. Basically, if you could, create a coyote or a canid free hunting area for the 5 county area, would be essentially analogous to what you have in Ontario. And then basically, the wolves could, persist there without any threat of human caused mortality, except for the roads, obviously. And then maybe from there you could, manage out. But that's hard in the eastern U.S. Provincial APPs of federal land and Canada, and we just don't have large federal lands like that here in the U.S. in the eastern U.S. So you're gonna have to work with the communities out there and cobble together local support to set up things like that. Oh, we are, and that's the other thing too about Louisiana, those Gulf Coast animals on the Gulf Coast. We have just high survival because the animals are in these really remote, isolated wetlands. The wetlands are either federal land where there's no hunting. The only way you can access them is with a boat, or it's oil extraction. So it's corporate land that's locked up, that's difficult to get through. And there's just very little human interactions out there. And so they have high survival for that reason. And so what we're seeing is if you want to retain wolves, you just have to stop killing them. And that's the thing. Just don't kill them.
Agreed. Thanks, Joey. Going off of your comment about the Gulf Coast population, we did have a question. Are there future plans to either entirely combine the Gulf Coast canids with the red wolf populations, or to release red wolves into Texas and Louisiana to join those Gulf Coast canids with high survival rates?
Okay. No, on the first one, I don't think there's any plans to merge the two and through captive breeding and whatnot. I would not suggest that. The Gulf Coast canids are called canids because taxonomically we're just trying to figure out what they are. But they're coyotes as far as I'm concerned, and to insert them in the captive breeding program or anything like that would just facilitate hybridization. And I don't think Fish and Wildlife Service is considering that. It's just too much of a risk. And there's going to be more ongoing research and need to sort of figure out what those things are. But like I said, where they're really relevant to us is understanding how they're persisting as a source population along the Gulf Coast, and how they're moving inland and moving those wolf genetic into the coyote population there and stabilizing it, I guess, or whatnot. In terms of a future reintroduction site, yeah, it could potentially be a good site, but again, the Fish and Wildlife Service is not investigating it right now. They haven't listed any sites. It's not something that's being pursued. But ideally, from like a cultural perspective, I mean, you would be bringing the red wolf back home. Those areas are basically where these wolves came from. And there are local landowners and folks out there, ranchers who support them. The FR Ranch is a very supportive piece of property. Actually, the property itself is not supportive, but the More Odin Wildlife Foundation that oversees a bunch of property out there, they've been supportive of us and the work that's going on out there, and they've advocated for having wolves be released out there too. So we do see support, and ideally, if there is any introgression with the wolves from those canids, I mean, obviously they would be acquiring some old red wolf genetic material that may have been lost with the bottleneck, but who knows what that genetic material does? It's not making those animals red wolves. It's not enough of it in there. So I don't, who knows what the genetics are. So anyway, that's me rambling. Sorry, guys.
Well, in the interest of time, knowing we have so many questions that we just won't be able to get to, I think we'll kind of leave with one last kind of overarching question. For everyone who's watching tonight, who has clearly indicated an interest in red wolves and wanting to see this species survive and really thrive across the East Coast, what are some ways people can support red wolves right now? I'll let you go, Joey, and then I'll go.
Oh, I would say just care, be vocal. I think recovering red wolves is a community effort. Anytime, I mean, anytime you see agencies not, acting in the best interest for the animal, speak up, let them know, read the research, and whatnot. Just be active, just care. I don't know what else to say other than just be there for the animals. Just like, just being there for a buddy, that's all.
I love that. Yeah, building off of what Joey said, using your voice, speaking up. We have red wolves today because of the Endangered Species Act, and the Endangered Species Act is facing some threats. And one thing you could do is let your representatives know that you support the Endangered Species Act, a fully funded Endangered Species Act, that you like wolves and you want to see red wolves expand and recover. We have an action alert section on our website, and we do have an alert that you could complete to show support for the Endangered Species Act that is facing various threats. There is a bill right now in the House that would severely weaken and essentially dismantle the Endangered Species Act, and that would directly impact red wolves and other wolves as well and other species. But as Joey was saying, I think using your voice, sharing what you've learned about red wolves with friends and family. As we mentioned, this recording will be available on our website. And when we post the recording, we'll also link to the research Joey mentioned. So you'll have a lot of information at your disposal that can be easily shared with friends and family, or even teachers, others in your life. And I think as we're talking about building a more empathetic world, it really starts with us. And so we are so appreciative for everyone joining us tonight and taking time out of your day to learn about red wolves. We're going to be celebrating red wolves all week long. Really, Red Wolf Week for us is all of the weeks, but we will be celebrating red wolves all week long. We have special red wolf themed merchandise, and we're sharing red wolf facts on social media. So a lot of ways to get involved, a lot of ways to show support for red wolves. But thank you all so much for joining us tonight and for, as Joey said, being a buddy to red wolves. So we hope to continue to engage with you further, and we hope everyone has a great night. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Daisy.